Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out devx.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
I'm joined this week by our managing editor, Anna Goel. Hey, Anna.
Hi, Raj.
And by Alyssa Mulene. Hey, Alyssa.
Hey, Raj. How are you doing?
Doing great. Great to hear from both of you. Alyssa, of course, is our global development reporter at DevX, based in DC, just like Anna and me. A beat that never sleeps. There's just a lot to cover. Alyssa, you had a bunch of stories, and we can just start there. This past week, I guess 133 members of the House of Representatives voted for something. You mentioned it in your piece. What did they vote for?
Yes, and I will temper it with the fact that this did not pass, but it was still kind of put to the House floor. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has made headlines for many, many different things, she is a far-right Republican representative from Georgia, had voted for Administrator Samantha Power to have her salary reduced to $1. It was part of a slew of amendments that were put forward in the state foreign affairs bill that the House put forward 2 Fridays ago, I believe now, back toward the end of June. And it was really just that was one of them. Another one was to scrap funding for U.S. aid altogether, also from Representative Greene. There was another one to put forward for ending funding for Ukraine. So there were lots of amendments thrown out. Many were rejected. Some made it in. But yeah, it was an interesting hearing to watch.
I mean, Alyssa, I hear from kind of two perspectives on this. One is, look, this is just performative. There's always been this wing in America's politics that's sort of anti-foreign aid, that's more isolationist. Don't pay too much attention to this sort of thing because, we had a Trump administration and, during those years, USAID's funding was flat to up. And so you don't really have to worry so much. There's the Democratic Senate, et cetera. And then I hear others saying, this is like a harbinger of a new era in aid politics. Tell us a little bit more about what you heard from people when you reported this piece.
Yeah, I think, Raj, you've really hit the nail on the head there. There's people that think, oh gosh, eye roll, this is a political stunt kind of thing. And to be fair, Marjorie Taylor Greene has done this for several other folks in the past in terms of this salary reduction to $1. So this is something that she's done and something that she tries to do. But at the same time, I mean, there were quite a number of different amendments that were really, really targeting foreign aid specifically. And you kind of have this ultimately culminating in a bill that was passed. And again, it didn't pass through the Senate. It's unlikely to actually make it and see the light of day. But it did pass through the Republican-led House, and it was a $7.6 billion drop. That's an 11% decrease for the U.S.'s international affairs budget for next year. Now, I think that most folks really feel that this, while not passing, does represent some sort of a mark in the sand for Republican members of the House, really saying, okay, this is our floor and we can negotiate up, but we're starting from a pretty low baseline here.
Yeah, and Anna, I'd love to get your take on this too, because part of it is the funding amount, which clearly the direction of travel from House Republicans is south when it comes to the volume of aid. But then there's also kind of reading the tea leaves to see what are their priorities, like where would they cut or where would they raise? And in particular, it seems like the UN and the UN agencies are in the crosshairs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of what I always call the usual suspects. It's definitely the UN agencies, including like World Health Organization. It's certainly a lot of these climate and gender equality programs. It would amount to, I believe, an 11% cut. And as you said, everyone is trying to read the tea leaves. And I think this gets to the bigger picture of people are trying to read the tea leaves when it comes to a potential second Donald Trump presidency, which is, a very real possibility. We've had a lot of, not to veer too much into U.S. politics, but we've obviously had a lot of developments, some Democrats asking Joe Biden to drop out of the race. The polls consistently show Donald Trump with a slight edge. And so, I agree with you that we always have these kind of messaging bills that ultimately go nowhere once they get through the meat grinder of the Senate. You always have a core group of Republicans, especially in the House, who want to, defund the UN, get rid of funding for U.S. aid, et cetera. But this time, I do think it's a bit different, potentially. You have a lot of the Republicans that Alyssa mentioned are allies of Donald Trump, whose suggestions I think it's safe to say he might take, somewhat seriously. And I think the other really important point is that you could have, in come November, Republicans kind of pull off a trifecta and take over the House, the Senate, and the White House. It's not impossible given how many key Senate races are much more precarious for Democrats this time around. So I think you are talking about a very kind of different ball game. So now these calls to defund the UN agencies, to get rid of climate programs, to substantially rethink U.S. aid, they're not necessarily certain to happen because, like you said, there were these calls in a previous Trump administration, but I no longer think that they are in the realm of the impossible. And that's why I think this is an ongoing, very important story for our community.
Yeah, and the tea leaf readers had kind of another development this past week with former President Trump essentially backing away, at least publicly, from this Project 2025, which has been the organization, put together through the Heritage Foundation that DevEx has been covering extensively to kind of get a sense for what might the policy priorities be in a second Trump administration when it comes to international development. Alyssa, you had a piece about this. Tell us more about what did the former president say and what are people thinking the implications are?
Yeah, definitely. So like Anna said, some really interesting developments earlier this week. So Project 2025, as Raj says, we've reported about it in the past. It's 922 pages. It's a really detailed description of where a conservative president could go on everything related to the U.S. government. Obviously, one chapter of that is foreign aid. And this particular document that is about foreign aid was written by a former advisor of U.S. aid under the Trump administration. So, these are folks that have worked with Trump. They're part of kind of the Trump world and Trump orbit. And while they kind of say that it wasn't necessarily Trump's proposals, it was, it's a lot of folks that have been involved with the former president very closely. Now, earlier this summer, Trump came out and said on Truth Social, his own social media platform, that he doesn't agree with some of the things that they're saying. He wishes them luck, but he has nothing to do with them. He actually said he didn't even know what Project 2025 was, or so a lot of that led to him coming out with a proposal of his own and his team's own, which was endorsed by the Republican National Committee earlier this week. And that's a 16-page document that kind of broad strokes promises, a lot of campaign slogans. Foreign aid is mentioned 0 times. So there is absolutely no reference to the topics that our readers really care about most, which leaves a lot of question marks, as these tea leaf readers have said to me in the past. It's a lot of filling in the gaps of, okay, what does this mean? Does he really want to separate from the Project 2025 proposals, a lot of which were written by close allies of his? Is this a campaign, kind of counter to distance himself from more extreme views? It's all really unclear right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this kind of gets to where everyone was grasping at straws, trying to get, clues into what could potentially happen over the next 4 years. And here we had a 900-page document. So it was a great resource. But I think Donald Trump kind of disavowing it was pretty dramatic, a pretty, a somewhat embarrassing rebuke for the people who wrote it. It was likely politically expedient. It started to generate some bad press. And I think, it probably might rub a lot of people the wrong way to have like 900 pages of policy prescriptions foisted on you. But I think it's important to note, even though Donald Trump says, as Alyssa pointed out, he didn't know the people who wrote it. That's a bit dubious because it was written by many people close to him. So I think there's a strong chance that these authors might come on board in a future administration. I think there's a good chance he may change his mind on at least some of these policies and that they could be instituted. So I think the larger takeaway for me is that it's certainly a little too early to relegate this kind of playbook to the dustbin of history, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's right. And especially because it aligns so well with what these House Republicans have been pushing in real time. Today, it gives you a sense that, well, look, these are House Republicans who are aligned with President Trump, and they're aligned with Project 2025 and what it's pushing. And what President Trump has come out with, this kind of shorter campaign proposal, doesn't actually say anything different about foreign aid. It just excludes it entirely. So I think for now, if you are trying to figure out what a second Trump administration would mean for foreign aid, the best places to look are what House Republicans are doing now and what Project 2025 says. It may not be a perfectly clear roadmap, but it's probably the best thing we have at this point to get a sense. And that alignment, especially around things like cutting funding for the UN, does seem to be a pretty clear focus and resonates with things we heard in the first Trump administration as well.
Yeah, and I think you see this almost from both sides. It's kind of the campaign reality where it doesn't necessarily make sense to get into details prior to, you don't want to overcommit yourself during the campaigning, to things. These details tend to be worked out then once someone is elected. But certainly in the case of Donald Trump and the 16-page document that, Alyssa mentioned, it's much more broad strokes than we're used to in the past. And so I think that's even probably a source of frustration for our community included, but I doubt we'll have any more specifics over these next few months. That's just my inclination.
There's something interesting here in terms of the fact that it is left out. I mean, obviously, foreign aid is 1% of the budget. So in some ways, it's not surprising. But in other ways, there's a lot of other proposals that former President Trump is pushing forth in his 16-pager. That includes an Iron Dome over the country for national defense. It includes kind of a number of different investments in, deporting, quote unquote, like pro-Hamas folks out of college campuses. Like there's a lot of different kind of things going on here, and it's worth taking a read. Again, not necessarily because there's anything that includes foreign aid, but to look at what those proposals and those priorities are. Another thing just to add is, I think in the course of reporting over the past few months on Project 2025, this document was referred to me by many different folks as some sort of a job proposal or a job application for a lot of these former Trump officials. And I think that's the way that a lot of people in the community are seeing it. It's if I were to get back into this spot, this is what I would propose. So again, to Anna's point, it's something to consider. It's something to read the tea leaves on. It's something to just keep watch of, because these people very well might be seated under a new and second Trump administration.
Yeah, that's a great point. So much of this really is going to be about the people that get these jobs, if there is a second Trump administration, and kind of what their views are, because a lot of these very minute details that are probably not going to rise to the highest level of attention of a future President Trump, but they will matter a lot to our community and to the world, and they may be, depending on the perspectives of the people who take the jobs, they may be important priorities for them. So certainly one of the things we're going to be continuing to track is, who would be a likely Trump team were he to take office, and would it be people like Mark Green, who was a aid administrator in the first Trump administration, or would it be people who are maybe more radical in terms of their views of what ought to change in foreign assistance? I would also say that, it'll be interesting to see what is said, if anything, at the Republican National Convention, which is just coming up in a few days, about foreign aid. I mean, it's true that maybe the Trump campaign wanted to distance itself from detailed policy prescriptions, but they might find the kind of rhetoric that Marjorie Taylor Greene displayed on the House floor interesting and politically expedient. They might want to talk about, not sending money overseas and instead spending it at home, as she talked about in the House floor. And that's been a common refrain for many decades when it comes to, opponents of foreign assistance. So it'll be interesting to just pay attention to what the rhetoric is there and whether it confirms some of these trends or potentially goes in a different direction. And as the campaign develops, it'll be interesting to see if there are any other statements from the former president about what he intends to do when it comes to the UN or any of the other issues that are raised in Project 2025.
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Advas Aldinger. I'm a senior reporter at DevEx, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of DevEx Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
Maybe we could turn to another country's exciting elections, and that is the UK, where a Labour government has come to power really in a pretty sweeping way. And there's some news from the UK. Anna, do you want to tell our listeners what we've learned this week?
Sure. So the results of the election July 4th weren't much of a surprise. The Labour Party had a landslide victory over the Conservatives. But there was a bit of kind of a political upset within Labour in terms of the development portfolio, which had been expected to go to a woman named Lisa Nandy, but instead went to Anneliese Dodds, who is the former Labour Party chair. It was, as our reporter Rob Merrick said, it was an unexpected pick from what everyone gathered. But I think what's notable here is her appointment kind of further clouds how much of a priority development will be under a new Labour government. You know, her title, for instance, doesn't include the actual word development. I don't know how significant that is, but more importantly, she has two jobs. She's also the Minister for Women and Equities, which is actually in a different department. So that's led to concerns among many NGOs whether she can successfully manage both portfolios. And I think it kind of gets to this bigger picture of, for development advocates, Labour's victory has kind of been one disappointment after another. The new Prime Minister Keir Starmer has effectively ruled out restoring an independent development department or returning aid spending to 0.7% of national income. So I think it doesn't bode well for those who had hoped that Labour would kind of come in as a savior and restore UK development to its former glory, if you will.
Right. At a minimum, it raises a lot of questions, right? People in the piece who mentioned how Lisa Nandy has had time, 10 months to get educated on these issues and get ready for this role. I've, had a chance to speak with her and hear her speak at events, and she's been getting into this development community and understanding the issues. And now suddenly, with no notice, is switched to being culture minister, and someone who probably didn't have the time to prepare for this role is foisted into this. In fact, Rob talks about the way that the world learned that Anneliese Dodds got this role was kind of funny, that she was seated at the table, at the cabinet table, with a name card in front of her. But it took, and the name card saying Minister of State Development, but it took a couple of days before they even confirmed that was her new job. And it was a bit of a surprise because people had expected her to have this other role focused on, women and gender. So there's a history in the UK of development ministers being named who didn't really want the job and getting the job as kind of a consolation prize when actually they wanted something else. And there's a chance that we may be facing kind of a similar situation here. Of course, it's very early, and Anneliese Dodds has this experience focused on women and gender equality that is highly relevant to her new development portfolio. So, perhaps it will work out well. But I think that's why there are some question marks around her.
Yeah, and I think just to add to, Rob has this line in the piece where he says, this is a quote, how many hours are there in a day issue, right? Because you've got Dodds holding these two roles, and what do what can you really get done with so much responsibility and so much on your plate? So it's just something to think about and something to keep our eyes on as the months continue rolling by.
I did note one interesting tidbit, and my source here is Wikipedia, so take that for what it's worth. But Anneliese Dodds apparently had run when she was a student at Oxford University for the student body presidency, and was fined £75 because she wasn't supposed to campaign via email, but apparently she did. And anyway, she got through that and ended up being elected and becoming the president of the student body at Oxford. So she appears to be at least somewhat indefatigable. And as Rob has mentioned, she's kind of had an up and a down in her political trajectory, having been the shadow secretary of the chancellor, for basically the equivalent of being U.S. Secretary of Treasury, and now has kind of found herself in this new role, which is functionally less powerful in the UK government. But perhaps she will rise again, as she did as an Oxford student.
That's definitely determined if she spent her own money as a college student.
That's right. Well, anyway, it's an interesting piece. And obviously, what happens in the UK is going to be hugely consequential. We know that there's not going to be a new DFID. There isn't going to be a new independent department, right? Keir Starmer has made that pretty clear. He's also made it pretty clear we're not going back to, 0.7% of gross national income going to the aid budget. That's pretty clear. And it looks like, at least for the medium term, there will still be a significant portion of the aid budget going to the housing costs of asylum seekers in the UK. So a lot of the kind of fundamental issues that the aid community has been grappling with, we know won't change. But there has been quite a bit of optimism that a Labour government will kind of reinvigorate a demoralized FCDO and set some new policy agendas that will actually kind of bring back the heyday, or something closer to the heyday of British development, when it was seen as really the leading bilateral aid agency in the world. So it remains to be seen, but we now know who the leader will be. And it'll be interesting to see if Anneliese Dodds can kind of fulfill some of those expectations.
And I think it's important to note we also have the David Lammy, the foreign secretary, who, he has talked about his ambitions to kind of redraw UK's relationship with the global South into this post-colonial era. So I think, it's overall, there still should be some optimism in terms of Labour and the development portfolio. And I think that there will be some movement and differences for at some point. But for now, it does seem like the status quo is kind of what's taking place.
Yeah, I think that's right. We had another story that is worth talking about, related to climate finance, and maybe this gives us another window on where development policy is headed. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this one, Anna?
Sure. So there was a study. It was by a group, completed by a group called Development Initiatives, and it basically confirmed what many people have long suspected, that wealthier nations are claiming to be giving lower income countries climate finance for projects that would have gone ahead anyway. In fact, they found that 40% of bilateral climate finance would have probably taken place regardless. And I think, this fits into the larger debate of just how difficult it will be to get wealthier countries to cough up, if you will, fresh new money, more money for a loss and damage fund, for example. And we saw these tensions flare, as we reported earlier a few weeks ago, at the recent midway talks to COP29 in Azerbaijan in November. Those took place in Bonn, Germany. And that's where wealthier countries kind of dodged the question of offering a specific sum for what's become known as, I may not get this correctly, new collective quantified goal, basically kind of a new goal in terms of providing climate finance. And in stark contrast, you had a group of African and Asian countries who put that sum in the range of something like $1.1 trillion, I believe. So pretty astronomical sum. And so it just shows that these sides are incredibly far apart in terms of what should be given as climate finance. And it's kind of an ominous sign as we go into COP29 in Azerbaijan, because the whole that's being billed as the climate finance COP. And right now, all signs point to huge disparities between wealthier and lower income countries.
Yeah, and it relates a lot to the conversation we've just been having about politics, especially in the U.S., because I think, Alyssa, a lot of what you reported around Project 2025 is an interest in getting away from funding things like climate, right? I think the chair of the House Appropriations Committee has talked about this. The subcommittee responsible for development finance has talked about this issue and saying, hey, we've got to maybe focus more on funding fossil fuels and less on climate. And yet here we have an organization taking a close look at the money that is targeted toward climate and saying, well, how much of it is really going toward climate finance, or is just being kind of marked that way?
Absolutely. And I think that's really good context to just put this piece in, but also it raises another topic that we've talked about in the past, with USAID and in the US and Washington and others, but it's that definitions, as wonky as it seems, are really important. And especially in development, as we're tracking numbers in terms of millions and billions of dollars. I mean, this piece kind of raised the fact that programs that are being tagged as quote unquote significant for the climate leaped by over 1,000% during 2009, from 2009 to 2021. And ones that were kind of principally focused on the climate was about 200%. So it's this piece really gets at like, okay, well, what are we tagging as which? Are those quote unquote significant pieces for the climate, significant programs for the climate? What does that mean? And I think to the way that Anna described it earlier, they might have happened anyway. We see this issue of definitions with tracking localization data, what's really local, what organizations really count as local. And it just kind of reinforces the need to be really specific and really precise when we're talking about this level and scale of funding going across the world.
Yeah, it gets to what I call pledgeflation, which is, every time we go and cover convenings of leaders, you hear big announcements, usually with billions attached to them, about funding pledges. And then you kind of have to go back and look at, well, is this new money? Is it really attributed solely to this issue that was being pledged about? And what's really under the surface? And often when you go back and you look at that, you come away a bit disappointed. And that is sort of what this piece is getting at. It, in fact, mentions a particular project that the World Bank has been funding in public transport in Chad and Cameroon, and essentially says, look, it's calling it climate finance. And yeah, sure, it has some mitigation of emissions associated with it, but it's a really bad deal. Like if you were trying to get mitigation of emissions, you wouldn't pay what this program is paying, which is $1,734 for every ton of greenhouse gas emissions averted. So on the one hand, you can see how the World Bank is right, maybe to say, hey, there is a climate component here, and we want to tag it. We have our own internal goal to reach 45% of World Bank projects that are climate aligned. But on the other hand, can we really call this a significant climate project if it's so marginal and so expensive for what it's achieving from a climate perspective? So it seems like a worthy debate to at least be happening.
Definitely.
All right, well, let's maybe pick up on one last piece we have for the week as we're running out of time. Anna, we had some coverage from our friends over at Politico about PEPFAR funding. And I wondered if you could share with our listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. As I wrote in our Newswire newsletter, the hits keep on coming for PEPFAR. It really became caught up in America's culture wars over the last several months over abortion, and that derailed a clean 5-year reauthorization of the program. Instead, it got a 1-year reprieve. Some people hailed it as a bipartisan compromise, but it's kind of kicking the can down the road because we're going to be here in the same spot having the same debate in a year. And what Politico reported, they revealed that the Biden administration wants to cut PEPFAR funding for fiscal 2025 by 6%. So it's another blow, and I think it's this one is very significant because it's not Republicans coming in trying to cut the program, it's the Biden administration. So I think that is a significant disappointment for advocates who say that the work is not done when it comes to fighting HIV/AIDS, especially with some countries in Africa becoming very hostile toward LGBTQ plus communities. We reported ourselves on a country, Botswana, who's become an upper middle income country. So they are bracing for transitioning out of PEPFAR and Global Fund funding. And there are a ton of concerns that this decrease in funding could jeopardize very hard-fought gains. I think it's important to remember PEPFAR is credited with saving 25 million lives over the last 2 decades. So, and then as the article Politico pointed out, the State Department will make kind of country by country budgets public toward the end of the summer. So this is a big one that we'll be keeping tabs on. And I'm sure that every single country that receives funding will be keeping tabs on.
Yeah, and it points to kind of a large question about when global health funding goes down, especially as countries are doing better from an income perspective, are those countries going to take on what used to be global funding and kind of fund it domestically through their own resources? And there's a mixed history around this, and there's concern. some people in the global health community think this is the right thing, that ultimately the only sustainable form of finance is domestic resources. And others are really concerned that, as countries graduate, so to speak, out of low and middle income status, that they will stop funding things like HIV/AIDS prevention at the level that they've been funded by programs like PEPFAR. So we're kind of watching in real time as these cuts take place, what countries like Botswana end up doing.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on that too, I mean, Jenny in this piece looked at Botswana and whether the government has been able to do it. And after they did graduate, at least to a certain extent, with funding going down, the government was not able to keep up and cut funding to organizations by around 30%, according to someone that Jenny spoke with. So yeah, that is what we're seeing. And it's kind of a first example of what happens when this support from PEPFAR, which has been there for years and years, is reduced.
Yeah, there's a broad feeling in the development community that, we talked about climate and how, important it is and how politically salient it is. It's also obviously a hot button issue in the U.S., as we described. But, there's a reality that a lot of people feel climate is getting the energy and the funding and the political support, particularly in Europe, and that maybe it's coming at the expense of global health. And I hear this a lot from global health leaders who are trying to find ways to make that climate and health connection stronger and looking for opportunities to kind of bring some of that climate funding into the health space. But this is a real issue. And I think PEPFAR, which at the moment it was created in the Bush administration, was highly politically relevant. It was seen as this coalition of faith leaders and national security leaders and business leaders and others, that maybe now that coalition's kind of moved to other areas. And there's a danger there for grant finance programs like PEPFAR when all the energy, the juice is in development finance programs that have a return on investment that use, private sector engagement. And so I think it's a really big question that people in the global health community are grappling with these days.
Yeah, and I think just to that point, real briefly, we've seen that in our discussions with the World Bank and its kind of greater focus on climate under President Ajay Banga. And there's a real debate, especially in lower income countries, whether that, shifting both the focus and funding toward climate change mitigation, especially, whether that will eat into funding for poverty alleviation programs, which many say is the fundamental purpose of the World Bank. So I think it's kind of one of those debates that ties into a lot of institutions that we cover.
Yeah, that's right. And that fundamentally comes back to the politics, which, as we started this conversation, this is sort of a hot political summer. Everybody is looking at elections around the world. We didn't even get a chance to talk about what happened in France, but the implications of these elections on global development and global development funding are huge. And we will continue to be reporting on a lot of these aid policy questions as these elections unfold and their consequences become clearer. So let's stay tuned for more on that front. I'm looking forward to this Republican convention coming up and hearing what's talked about there. We'll see how the Biden campaign shakes out with the calls that you mentioned, Anna, for him to be replaced on the ticket. And we'll just keep covering what these implications are for our community. So thank you so much for listening in, everybody. And a big thank you to Anna Goel and Alyssa Milene.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks, Alyssa.
Thanks so much.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a DevX Pro member by going to devx.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.